Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, Professor, for continuing the series with such an extremely informative and enlightening talk. I will admit, prior to reading your chapter in the book, I hadn't actually heard of Dudley Thompson myself. And then in reflecting on his achievements, for me, it just goes to show the importance of having the administrators, the thinkers, and the strategists who are not necessarily under the spotlight or in the headlines or front-facing. I think it shows that Pan-Africanism is also real work and not just a kind of grandeur, idealist notion for us to pay lip service with. So if you don't mind, if we could just take a few moments to dive a little deeper and just explore your thoughts on Dudley and also the state of African politics just a little bit more broadly. So my first question would be, as I just mentioned, I was quite unfamiliar with the work of Dudley Thompson. So why do you think that despite how instrumental he was in decolonization, particularly in East Africa, that he's perhaps not as celebrated as the likes of someone like Garvey, for example?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and it makes me think about the strategy that Dudley Thompson took in his advocacy of Pan-Africanism. He was not as how should I put it? He was not as strident in his demands as Marcus Garvey was. He was not as radical. And in fact, I think one of the challenges that we have looking at Dudley Thompson's life's work is that he tended to be in the middle. He tended to be a pragmatist, but holding on to a very idealistic vision of Pan Africanism. And sometimes those two things don't always mesh. And so, because you can have people on the far left who consider him to be too moderate, and you have people on the further right who considered him to be a little bit too left of center. So it was somewhere in between those two positions, I think, that we find Dudley Thompson operated. So he's not as celebrated as Marcus Garvey, but I think if anyone sort of takes time to look through what he had done and to read his writings, one sees the fundamental pragmatism that he tried to attach to his attempt to move towards that vision of Pan-Africanism, which he never gave up. He never gave up the idea of a Pan-Africanist society. He never gave up the idea that the possibility of unification of African peoples, both on the continent and in the diaspora. So that was a normative vision that kept him going. But because of his pragmatism, obviously a lot of things went a little slower than most people would like. And he became more of a footnote rather than a headline in many of these situations. I think that probably explains why he's not as well known as some of the
Yeah,
others.
okay. And then also kind of sticking to the subject of Garvey as well, you do mention their different approaches, as you just explained. Do you personally feel like having a variety of approaches and voices within the kind of Pan-African movement is a help or perhaps more of a hindrance at times?
Well, I have to say, I'm of the view that the more voices we have, the better, and the diversity of positions should be encouraged. There's no point in trying to sort of force everyone to think exactly along the same lines when it comes to what Pan Africanism ought to be. Of course, in discussions and debates, one want to move towards, if you can, a consensus of opinion, and I think that's important. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are different voices out there. There are different ways of understanding this approach towards Pan-African ideologies, and try to somehow marry those positions the best way we can.
Yeah.
So I'm of the view that there's no harm in having multiple voices in the Pan Africanist movement. There is, we can't help that, but I think that there should be an overarching vision, and I think that's very well expressed by Dudley Thompson, a normative vision that everyone can sort of buy into, and that is the notion that African peoples have been mistreated, as a result of slavery, as a result of colonization, imperialism, and that we need to bring about a different form of international justice for these people. And if we have to become unified to do that, then that so be it. That's the way in which we can get to that level of reparatory justice.
Yeah, and I know that with WADU, so being the World African Diaspora Union, that was one of their objectives, wasn't it, in terms of trying to bring together and unify all the different individuals and associations, organizations that there are all within this umbrella of Pan-Africanism.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think that would be something that would definitely strengthen the movement. It just seems like such an incredible task because there are so many. So do you believe that it's something which could happen, and what might be some of the steps towards bringing that goal a little bit closer?
Well, the major thing is listening and trying to understand each other's position. You're right. The WADU, I mean, is a good example of this. The attempt to unify the different associations and so on that are working, striving towards sometimes the same goal, but taking different strategies to get there. I think if you understand that it's okay to have different tactics in a process towards the goal that we're trying to achieve, that could be the first part of trying to understand each other's position. But you have to consult. I think this is one of the things, the biggest challenges for or divided people in Africa is the absence of the kind of consultation, the listening to each other that needs to be done in order to be able to arrive at a common position. We have to be a little bit more tolerant in terms of each other's differences too, and try to reconcile those differences as best way we can. So it's not an easy task, of course. It's going to take a long time, and I think those people who are trying to sort of was trying to force sort of the Back to Africa movement, for example, recognized fairly quickly why that didn't quite work. In some cases, African people on the continent didn't accept, Caribbean peoples initially. There was a tension between the diaspora and the people on the African continent. But over time, I think with education, with the shift in knowledge, a movement away from the Eurocentric views of looking at the world, and understanding that there is strength in the indigenous approaches and the indigenous teachings in Africa that we can draw on. I think over time those differences can be mended.
Okay, thank you. The Negrophobia that Thompson spoke about, it's an interesting idea. How serious a problem would you say that is today? And then what do you think some of the antidotes to that might be, both kind of social antidotes or political antidotes, if it's possible?
Well, one of the challenges I think that Dudley Thompson had, particularly when he tried to rehabilitate Marcus Garvey in Jamaica, with this notion of Negrophobia, and in some cases, the African folks in the Caribbean were their own biggest problems. The self-loathing, the kind of, I think some of the negative aspects, which were brought on in large part by the colonial powers, helped to perpetuate that. And I think it's important for the African people to have a much better, more self-confidence in their abilities and what they're capable of doing to avoid that problem in the future.
Okay, thank you. Staying in Africa, then following on from that question, considering the kind of current political climate and structure within Africa, do you think the federal government that Thompson spoke of is something that is feasible? So having this kind of federal government of Africa, is it something that's feasible, and also is it something that would be beneficial in your view?
The notion of a federal government of Africa on the surface sounds like a good idea. If that's possible to bring about sort of a renaissance of the African continent and eventually the unification of African countries, But we know how difficult that is, the challenge that's going to pose. Just think about what's happening right now in Nigeria alone, and the challenges that the Nigerian state has with the different regions and different peoples, the North and the South, and the Muslims and the Christians, and the challenges that you have of nomadic versus sedentary populations. I mean, it's a very difficult situation. And don't forget, it took centuries, right, to bring about the kind of division of the African people that the Europeans did with colonization and imperialism. It's going to take centuries to be able to correct those problems. African states, to be quite honest, many of them are basically artificial constructs based on a European notion of statehood. Um, you have to sort of completely erase that notion of the Westphalian state in order to be able to bring about the kind of unification that we are talking about here. Many African states are not viable as states simply because they're basically artificial constructs, as I said before. And at the same time, we're living in a globalized era, what I call an intermestic era, as opposed to an international era. But intermestic era in which the lines between the international and domestic are so blurred that we wonder whether or not individual states, even with the resources, the United States itself, a country with lots of resources, but we wonder how viable those states are based on the Westphalian model of statehood. The Westphalian pillars, as some people have said, are decaying at this particular point in history. And this is happening even within the African continent, where they're still trying to hold on to a model of statehood that was imported into Africa, imposed on Africa. And I think if we don't move away from that artificial model that's being imposed, we can't get very far.
Okay. So do you then think that there needs to be some type of restructuring of borders or national lines?
Well, first, I think personally, there has to be, and this has to happen at the international level, because at the individual level, it's not working. There has to be a restructuring of the international system itself. That's a radical move, right? The restructuring the international system. We tried it in the 1970s, right, with the new international economic order. We tried it with the new international information order. We know that there are so many challenges to trying to restructure the global system in a way that would be much more beneficial to countries that have suffered these indignities of slavery and decolonization of colonization and imperialism. So it's not going to be easy, but the thing is, I think that we have to have a vision towards this new international justice system, where every single individual are counted as being worthwhile and worthy of their humanity, and treat every single person with that kind of humanity which we want to be treated ourselves. So that's the first step, and it's a very, very long way from getting to that point right now, I think, not just in Africa, but across the globe.
Definitely. So moving on to reparations, which is another part of the chapter and something which Thompson was very passionate about. He did argue that a legal precedent had been set by these earlier examples that are mentioned with the Japanese in America and also survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants. So what do you think is the main reason then that despite the transatlantic slave trade being one of the worst crimes committed against humanity, that reparations are still, with all the arguments made, yet to be paid?
Well, I think this stems from the view, and I have to say that the George Floyd moment made this a reality for me. The view that there are still people in our societies, in Western society, that view people of color, Black people, African descent, people of African descent, as less than human. If you think about it, right? Chauvin knelt on this Black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Who does that to any other human being? He has to think of this individual as less than human to do something like this. There's still that view that people of color, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, are less than human, and we have to get away from that notion. And so it's something that has to be challenged, not just in terms of the American society or British society, but across the globe. There's this notion of global apartheid that some people have written about. The fact that we've divided people along the lines of color, and we've made people feel inferior to other people just based on the notion of color and race. So I think we have to go to that notion of challenging anti-black racism in a serious form, in a serious way first. I've been watching and listening to professor from the United States who have been arguing that we need to sort of take on this mantle of opposition to anti-black racism in a serious way before we can actually make any sort of advancements as a society. And I think he's absolutely right. That's Professor Kendi who's made that argument. And I think from his work, I support what he's saying, that we need to be strident in our opposition to anything that's anti-racist, anything that's anti-black racist, anything that's anti-indigenous racist. We need to sort of bring together and coalesce around this anti-racist approach, and I think the time for that is right now.
Yeah. So then, do you have any of your own views regarding how reparation payments could be structured? Because there is again many different voices. Some saying, should it be paid to individuals? Should it be more as grants, setting up institutions? How do you think it might be structured and distributed?
That's a challenge, a major challenge. I have to remember, I have to say and admit that I was not a big fan of reparations because I always felt that it was not feasible to give individual compensation for something that happened, four centuries ago or something like this. The problem of reparations is that we cannot think of them as compensation for individuals anymore. We have to think in terms of the societal damage that has been done to a people, and find a way to be able to address that societal damage. Now, this can come in the form of forgiveness of debt for countries that are struggling with a burden of debt. This can come in the form of perhaps educational reimbursements for education. This can come in the form of addressing the healthcare problem that's faced by many people in Black societies, building more sustainable health systems. It can become simple things like changing the diet of individuals. Those kind of things needs to be brought into place. I like the idea of what the Caribbean governments have done through CARICOM in addressing the issue of NCDs. They had a major conference in Port of Spain, in Trinidad, focused on NCDs because they recognized it was a major intergenerational problem for Black citizens of the Caribbean. And they were able to push that idea from the Caribbean up to the UN system. One of the first times ever in the history where you saw a movement like this from the bottom to the top, rather than being imposed upon us in the Caribbean from the top. And I think this is sort of, we have to do more of this. We have to sort of let the people address their issues at the local levels, and raise those issues right up to the top where we can see substantial change happening. I call it sort of a reverse subsidiarity principle. Subsidiarity is a principle that's used in the European context. But subsidiarity governance is important because it can give the empowerment of individuals at the lowest levels of governance, give them the empowerment to be able to pursue the goals that they need to pursue in order to bring about much more healthy, much more sustainable, economically sustainable society. So I think that's where we can start.
Yeah, okay. And then I'm just going to squeeze in one more question, because I know there's a lot of talk going on in the chat, so I do want to open up the Q&A in one moment. But just to finish this section, what lessons do you think we could learn from the work and the successes of Dudley Thompson?
Well, the one thing I can say after sort of spending some time looking at Dudley Thompson was the importance of maintaining a vision, maintaining one can say it's a utopian vision. A lot of people think that utopianism is a negative, but in fact, you need to have a vision in order to be able to push towards this ideal. But at the same time, keeping your feet on the ground is important. The pragmatism of Dudley Thompson, the fact that he had step by step processes to get to where he wanted to go, I think is an important lesson we can learn from him. I mean, he was not always successful. Sometimes he failed to reach this destination. But you have to have a goal towards a vision of this destination that you want to arrive at. And then you have to put in place some pragmatic steps in order to get there. And I learned from Dudley Thompson the importance of having those steps in place.
Okay. Well, thank you so much once again, just for your insights, your analysis. As we said to Professor Ade last week, we're lucky to have people like yourself who are just uncovering these histories and these narratives, which we need to contextualize Pan-Africanism in the correct way. And we really do appreciate your research and your perspectives.